Hello and good evening from Smith Hall on the University of Washington campus. My name is Adam Warren and I am an associate professor in the Department of History. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the third lecture of the 2021 History Lecture Series. Delighted that you can be with us and look forward to a stimulating talk and discussion. Before I begin, I would like to acknowledge that while this event takes place virtually, it is being filmed, transmitted, and in many cases viewed on the historic and contemporary lands of the Duwamish, Suquamish, and Muckleshoot nations, and other Coast Salish peoples who call the waters and coastline of the Salish Sea home. Tonight, it is an honor to introduce Professor Bruce Hevly, our third speaker in the series. Professor Hevly is a historian of science and technology whose research makes important contributions to our understanding of how science, especially physics and nuclear science, transformed the American West over the course of the 20th century. His work has also done much to enhance our historical understanding of the practice of scientific research in military institutional settings. Having completed his PhD in 1987 at Johns Hopkins University, Professor Hevly has been a much valued member of the Department of History. Professor Hevly is the co-editor and co-author of multiple published works. These include Big Science, The Growth of Large-Scale Research, which he co-edited with Peter Gallison. In that volume, Professor Hevly helped trace the growth of physics research at Stanford between 1935 and 1962, and also wrote about the relationship between big science and big history. Working with Department of History Emeritus Professor John Findley, Professor Hevly then published The Atomic West, a multidisciplinary and multi-sided volume that explores the impact on the West of the development of atomic power. Professor Hevly and Professor Findley also co-authored Atomic Frontier Days, Hanford and the American West, a study that has been described in reviews as, quote, a compelling, nuanced, and authoritative read, an essential book for anyone interested in nuclear history, end quote, and as one that, quote, effectively blends the history of the nuclear complex with the histories of environmentalism, community identity, regionalism, and politics. What especially impresses me about Atomic Frontier Days is that not only does it chart the federal government's effort to develop Hanford as a nuclear site, it also shows how local communities negotiated and shaped that process, courting federally funded modernization initiatives and lobbying for their own ends. Beyond these works, Professor Hevly has been a frequent contributor to Pacific Northwest Quarterly, and indeed he's been managing editor of the journal, in addition to publishing in history of science journals such as Osiris, the annual journal of the History of Science Society. In introducing Professor Hevly, I would be remiss if I did not mention his many contributions to the department, the university, and broader communities across Washington state. Within the Department of History, Professor Hevly is a reliable citizen and a dedicated teacher, one who offers an impressive range of courses on the history of science and technology. By going above and beyond what is expected of him in the classroom, he has done much to support our undergraduate minor in the history of science, as well as the university's interdisciplinary major in the history and philosophy of science. He has also taught courses in military history, with a large audience of eager students. Professor Hevly is an equally dedicated mentor to graduate students, one who has trained doctoral candidates working on topics ranging from technology displays in museums and exhibitions to the global history of oceanography, to most recently the history of climate change science. I've learned a great deal from him by serving on graduate committees with him. Finally, having served for many years as director of the Center for the Study of the Pacific Northwest, Professor Hevly remains deeply involved in regional historical organizations and events. Among others, he regularly serves as a judge for the Washington State History Day contest, which brings together high school students annually to present their own research projects. Professor Hevly's lecture this evening grows out of a new project that focuses on the history of firearms as a technology. Having viewed the rehearsal last week, I can assure you that we are in for a treat. While we are listening and during the discussion at the end, please feel free to enter questions you may have in the Q&A feature on Zoom. You may also upvote questions already posed that you would like answered. Additionally, viewers on YouTube and Facebook may submit questions by entering them into the comments sections on those platforms. And with that, I am delighted to welcome Professor Hevly to the virtual stage to present Arming the Police and the Social Source of Our Distresses.
Thank you very much, Professor Warren. And thanks to all of you for watching this evening. I'm speaking to you actually from the Methow Valley in north central Washington, the historic home of the Methow people. And I want to acknowledge the landscape that I'm currently occupying. So let me start by asking you to imagine, if you will, that after his loss in the contested presidential election of 1876, Governor Samuel Tilden of New York chose to mobilize the New York State Guard for a march on Washington, D.C. He had at his disposal state troops armed with New York rifles and trained in marksmanship on the state's target range at Creedmoor, Long Island. And you see an image of a competition at that range here. Now later, this was the site of an insane asylum, but it was first developed by New York's National Rifle Association as a site for marksmanship training. Governor Tilden didn't pursue this option, ceding the presidency instead to Rutherford B. Hayes. But the resources he might have drawn on 20 years later helped to influence the first police target shooting program and the first major effort to arm police officers with a standard weapon in the name of establishing social order. I want to do three things in tonight's talk. First, I want to introduce some of the broader themes in the history of technology that are relevant to all of the talks that you're seeing this month. Second, I want to make a firm connection to Freud's Civilization and its Discontents, which provided the title for our lecture series this year. Surely this is the winner of our discontent. And the use of force by police officers against their fellow citizens, as well as disciplined employment of firearms in political discourse and in demonstrations, has been a large part of our discontent and our dis-ease over the last year. So I devote most of my time to a third task and try to give you a case study of the history of technology in action. Here looking at the adoption, at the behest of Commissioner Theodore Roosevelt, of a standard police sidearm by the New York Police Department in 1896. This was the Colt New Police .32 caliber revolver. I want to convince you of this, that every bullet fired has a history, both in physical terms, and the study of internal and external ballistics has been a feature of physics since the scientific revolution, but more importantly, in the history of technology and society. Now, the history of technology arises out of discontent. When the field was established in the late 1950s, it was very largely a response to the existential threat of nuclear weapons. That threat, in turn, raised some fundamental questions. Does technology develop according to its own irresistible force? That is, does technology determine history? And is technology itself somehow a matter instead of necessity? That is, of processes that continuously elevate one best answer to every problem. If so, we are carried along passively by processes that we can't control. Discontent, indeed. But also the motivation to challenge the idea of technology's inevitable development and inevitable consequences. The field developed some general ideas that most in the field would endorse emerged. First, like most everything in history, technology changes within history. It doesn't just act on it. Technological systems are products of choice, not necessity. Second, we build the world we live in, and thus that world is subject to change if we choose. Historians of technology aim to find a sense of hope in the fact that the outcome of existential threats is not inescapable. Third, the history of technology has to deal with technological artifacts themselves, rather than boxing them off while treating only their effects. And finally, we should be suspicious of explanations that depend on appeals to genius to account for the emergence of technological change. I'll at least touch on all four of these aspects of my discipline as we go on tonight. Now, what does all of this have to do with our theme? In chapter 3 of his Civilization and Its Discontents, Sigmund Freud addresses our disappointment with ongoing challenges that remain undiminished in the modern world. Our control over nature, he notes, is not complete, as Professor Thomas's talk last week showed so well. Our bodies fail us, despite our hopes to transcend them, not unrelated to Professor Raphael's discussion of how we represent bodies in photography. Finally, Freud discusses the social source of our distresses, as he calls it. That is, the inadequacy of our methods of regulating human relations in the family, the community, and the state. Systems, Freud says, that we ourselves have created that do not ensure protection and well-being for us all. Handguns on the belts of police officers, of course, are justified just in those terms, in terms of an investment in social well-being. Yet, as Freud suspected, like all of our social systems, they do not ensure well-being for all. But how did those handguns wind up on the belts of police officers? So let's look at one artifact and at least crack open the black box a bit to see how it worked, and particularly how it meant to resolve the problem of social order, or at least why it seemed to one important actor, Police Commissioner Theodore Roosevelt, that such a technology might do so. Now, this artifact, the Colt Police Revolver, did not arise as an inevitable product of the history of weapons. It arose from a particular urban context, the history of New York City, and within it, the challenges to industrial order at the end of the 19th century, along with Roosevelt's embrace of technological advances and racialist thinking to impose order on the city as police commissioner. Tools reflect the purposes for which they were built, as well as the history behind their emergence. And so we need to understand these elements. Let's look at some history first. Beginning in the early 1870s, New York began to create a distinctly urban target shooting culture at the behest of a group of former Army officers and shooting enthusiasts. With a subsidy from the state legislature, New York's somewhat grandiosely named National Rifle Association developed a long-range shooting grounds in suburban Queens, territory recently made accessible via the Long Island Railroad. State support would give first priority to National Guard companies for training at the site, and also help support a New York industrial concern, the Remington Firearms Company. Buying local, the state's Guard formations were armed with a state rifle, not one from the federal arsenal at Springfield, Massachusetts. Now, without going into too much detail on a much larger subject, let me just say that who shoots, what they shoot, and what they shoot at is a matter of considerable historical contingency. Shooting ranges are one of the places where we can see these choices being made in history. And so shooting ranges as distinctive spaces go along with gardens, with golf courses, laboratories, all places where we can see science and technology taking form and acquiring a certain meaning. Here you see a target pit at the Creedmoor Range with its circular bullseye target and its attendant to mark carefully the scores of target shooters. New York had suffered for some time under regimes of undisciplined firearms use, first at the hands of volunteer fire companies who styled themselves as target shooting clubs and took drunken excursions into the suburbs if they weren't engaged in outright insurrection, as they had been during the New York draft riots of the Civil War. I think now we can certainly sympathize with a New York Guard colonel who opined in 1867 that it is never safe for any community to have irregular bodies of armed men patrolling the streets and practicing with firearms. In contrast, the Guard itself in general did no target shooting. Marksmanship was not regarded as a necessary skill for a soldier. That changed markedly over the second half of the 19th century. By Theodore Roosevelt's time as police commissioner in the 1890s, target shooting culture had taken hold, as you can see in this 1890 painting. And this painting represents something of a fantasy on the part of the artist. But if you look in the background, you'll see one of the soldiers striking a very well-defined marksmanship pose with one of his elbows propped on his hip. This is the kind of thing you would learn on the Creedmoor target shooting grounds. Prior to establishing standards of behavior on the shooting range, New York's Guard had a record of firing indiscriminately into disorderly crowds, as in the 1867 Orange riots in the city. And this was part of what marksmanship training was meant to correct. The new target range at Creedmoor then was a place of order, of accountancy, of self-discipline, of science. Guardsmen were taught that a trip to Creedmoor was not a drunken day away from the city. There was to be no fighting with conductors on the train, no seeing how close your bullet could come to the target attendant at the far end of the range, no drinking on the way to the shooting range. Marksmen learned to account for every shot fired, recording the conditions and the result. Records were kept in ink, mistakes were struck out with a single line and initialed by a statistical officer. Target rifles indeed developed into forms that were useless on the battlefield. And you've already seen an image from Creedmoor of the remarkable contortions of long-range marksmen with long-barreled rifles, striking poses they never would on the battlefield. Target rifles represented the oft-repeated idea that they were instruments of precision, representing the scientific and industrial culture of the late 19th century. Under pressure from even more scientific shooters in New England, the NRA adopted the bullseye-shaped target, which we now take for granted, but which represented a departure from the non-circular and more practical military-style target that rewarded those who kept their shots within 6 feet of the ground. Before long, guardsmen not only drilled with discipline, they shot with discipline as well. Confronted with ethnic unrest and industrial protest, disciplined trips, I should say, to the shooting range, and indoor practice at the castle-like National Guard armories built in the city, as on college campuses later in the century, reinforced Creedmoor's lessons. And it's important to note here that target shooting, at least, was not about the application of force or the threat of violence alone. The Creedmoor model extended into a national shooting culture, one in which the marksman was urged to turn their body into a machine rest, while foregoing alcohol, caffeine, and tobacco. Increasingly, target shooting was about internalizing the edicts of industrial order, accuracy, precision, self-discipline. Now let's move ahead to the 1890s. New York remains an industrial city, and at least to the ambitious young politician Theodore Roosevelt, a profoundly corrupt one. Roosevelt had been a young teenager during the early days of international competition at Creedmoor, when target shooting grabbed the public's attention, hailed as far superior to baseball as a national pastime. In fact, Roosevelt received his first set of spectacles and his first gun the year that the NRA was established in New York in 1871. As a keen shooter and sportsman himself, he was well aware of the tradition of Creedmoor shooting. One of his closest friends was editor of the journal Forest and Stream, which covered precision shooting in great detail. In 1896, Roosevelt, in his role as a reforming city police commissioner, decided that the department would adopt a standard sidearm, the Colt .32 caliber police revolver, and that officers would be required to learn how to shoot it accurately. While New York officers had been armed, their weapons were non-standard and non-functional, for shooting rabid dogs unless a bystander was hit by mistake. Now, at first glance, we might take for granted that police officers should be armed, and that Roosevelt, a sometime cowboy, would naturally choose the Colt Revolver as the weapon of choice. Roosevelt had spent part of a couple years as a ranch owner in the West, and he wrote in tremendously detailed terms of the weapons that were his companions on the frontier. He led a wave of Harvard graduates into the West, where they attempted to profit, but also to impose order. Roosevelt himself was a volunteer sheriff. Guy Waring found Washington's Okanogan County too lawless, at least around the Loomis country of the Okanogan Valley. And so he founded his own town, Winthrop, where he expected people to behave themselves. And there, Waring hosted his fellow Harvard alum, Owen Wister, who fantasized about an Eastern Cavalier, the Virginian, who held bad men in line. Like Roosevelt, Waring and Wister brought ideas of regulation, not always welcome, to the West, not Western values to the East. After his Western hiatus, Roosevelt returned to public life as a member of the Federal Civil Service Commission, and then in 1895 as one of New York City's police commissioners. And here we return to this central artifact, the police revolver. What contextual elements help to explain Roosevelt's choice of this technology? What made the revolver responsive to the demand for reform? Well, here I think we can turn to Roosevelt's frontier experiences, although we need to do that in a little bit of a critical fashion. When Roosevelt described one of his own hunting experiences to an Eastern correspondent, this was an occasion on which he had tracked a grizzly bear to its lair and killed it with a single shot. Roosevelt clearly reflected the target shooting milieu in which he grew up. That is, the Creedmoor culture. He marked the successful shot, as you can see on the screen, in terms of the craftsman's measure, the carpenter's rule. And in this letter, Roosevelt clearly yokes what he had discovered as his own personal characteristics of discipline, of calmness, even in a dangerous situation, with a sort of craftsman-like outcome, a very precisely delivered bullet. Here Roosevelt's reflecting something you could also find, for example, in the writings of the sociologist Thorsten Veblen, what Veblen called the instinct of workmanship. And it's hard to overstate the influence of industrial values on all aspects of American life in the late 19th century. These values were seen as a source of lessons that could be applied to individuals anywhere they were in their life, not just in the workplace. Order, self-discipline, application, accuracy, precision. All the more so because these were the values that members of the upper class, like Roosevelt, wanted to see in their working citizens in places like New York City. So the revolver became a tool for Roosevelt as reformer, but certainly not the only one. As police commissioner, Roosevelt battled against corruption with new technology, which he believed represented efficiency and honesty. He found the New York City Police Department to be a snake pit of corruption, of bribery, of graft, and he vowed to reorganize the organization of the New York City Police. Things like civil service examinations or examinations for hiring and promotion within the police department were a technology that could be used to impose order on a disorderly system. But Commissioner Roosevelt invested in nuts and bolts as well. He mandated the extensive use of modern technology, bicycles and telephones, as instruments of reform. Colt then offered the most up-to-date technology available, a brand new revolver, fresh from the factory. All that was required was to discipline the bodies of police officers to learn how to use it. So 3 factors help to explain Roosevelt's technological choice of the Colt Revolver, I think. And none of them are to be found in the ranch country of the Dakotas. Rather, they're found in the industrial city that Roosevelt was trying to manage as police commissioner. Colt had been marketing revolvers to police officers and householders for some time. Here you see an earlier model depicting a criminal with a knife confronting a policeman with a revolver, in the spirit of Sean Connery's character in The Untouchables. If they bring a knife, we bring a gun. Despite Colt's assiduous marketing of this technology, no one had adopted the Colt revolver, or indeed any revolver in New York, as a standard issue weapon. Yet contextual factors moved Roosevelt to adopt a standard weapon in 1896. Among the resources on which Roosevelt could draw, first of all, was the Creedmoor tradition. Roosevelt hoped to do for the police department what he had seen done for the New York Guard during his brief stint as a member of the Guard 15 years before. And here, as a matter of happy accident, Roosevelt could draw on avocational shooters within the police department, particularly a patrolman named W.E. Petty, who became marksmanship instructor at New York's first police academy, indeed America's first police academy, which was simply a marksmanship training program set up in New York City at Roosevelt's behest. Petty quickly advanced to sergeant as the lead instructor in this program. It used Creedmoor targets, which were moved from the range in Queens into Manhattan, housed in a National Guard armory, and every member of the New York department was required to rotate through the armory and satisfy standards of marksmanship under Petty's instruction. Second, I think Roosevelt responded to the reputation of Colt as a marvel of precision craftsmanship, one that really rested in part in a misunderstanding of the meaning of interchangeable parts for mass production. Now, entrepreneurs who wanted to produce large quantities of goods at an inexpensive price, along with military reformers who wanted to introduce uniformity into military culture, had both aspired to the production of interchangeable parts for manufactured items from the beginning of the 19th century, indeed from the late 18th century. One of the first successful instances of this entrepreneurial activity was the production of wooden clocks. And the most important producer of these clocks learned a key lesson. If you want to mass produce an item with interchangeable parts, you need to have a certain amount of slop in the way the parts fit together. There needs to be a lot of shaking and rattling. And here you can see, this is the back of an American wooden clock, a Terry clock. All of the elements of the clock's works are made so that they can slide back and forth in and out of holes or along connecting rods to make it possible for someone to assemble a clock out of any set of pieces they happen to pull together. When these techniques were applied to objects made out of metal, and especially firearms, which have to fit together tightly so as not to injure the operator, that turned out to be a much more difficult proposition. Firearms with truly interchangeable parts, which the government, for example, demanded by the middle of the 19th century, were much more expensive than those where parts were filed to fit. But Samuel Colt developed the reputation for precision craftsmanship partly by canny marketing. He knew that there was demand, there was an allure to the idea of interchangeable parts. And so he offered his products as being fully interchangeable. As he would say, any set of parts promiscuously drawn from parts barrels in the shop could be assembled into a high quality piece of equipment. Now, as Colt represented this idea in the 19th century, it was very largely false. And a historian of technology named David Hounshell demonstrated this in a very simple fashion. If you go into the Smithsonian Museum and you pull out all the Colt revolvers in the museum's collections, you'll find that in those revolvers, every piece of the revolver has a serial number that's stamped into it. And that's because only one set of parts would really go together after they'd been carefully filed to fit by a master gunsmith. Now you can see in this image, this is a slightly later version of the Colt police revolver. There's a myriad of pieces here. And Colt's representation of the ideal of them all being carefully crafted so that they were absolutely identical, something which the industry indeed later achieved, that's the kind of thing that would speak to the ideal that I think Roosevelt was striving for as well, an ideal of uniformity and of order. So along with the Creedmoor tradition and the ideal of interchangeable parts in the most modern Colt revolver of 1896, I think also Roosevelt relied on his own racialist sensibilities and the way those sensibilities would resonate with the goals he was trying to achieve as commissioner of police. He was very clear in all of his writings that he sought police officers who reflected, as he understood it, the values of a Northern European race, values of self-discipline and of craftsmanship. These people, as you'll note here, were orderly. They were an antidote to the disorder that he aimed to remove from the police department and by extension from the urban industrial landscape. His ideal officers, as he said, came from a little patch of old Native America, which had been taken within the limits of the huge, polyglot, pleasure-seeking city. These were men of the very type I most wished to see on the police force, men of strong physique and resolute temper, sober, self-respecting, self-reliant. These were exactly the values that were inculcated by marksmanship training, first at Creedmoor and then in the New York City police training ranges. Now, target shooting, which spread from New York City to the rest of the country in the forms defined by the National Rifle Association, was an urban movement. It relied first on what you might think of as an institutional iron triangle. At one corner, Creedmoor and the National Rifle Association. At another, the city's retail and publishing establishments, which publicize standards of accuracy and advertise target rifles and range gear, including publishing exemplary targets with their holes neatly grouped near the bullseye. And then in the final corner, New York civic institutions, the Guard, the police department, and its public schools, which soon established target shooting as an interscholastic sport because of the ways in which the discipline of marksmanship resonated with the self-discipline expected of successful scholars. This structure then in turn appealed to a cultural triangle just as adamant, comprising industrial values, ideals of civic order, and racial categories. So, Governor Tilden did not march on Washington in 1876, despite the dodginess of the way that that presidential election was resolved. In fact, by that time, the militia system of the United States had all but disappeared. By the turn of the 20th century, the state guards would come under much more direct control of the federal government. States could no longer choose their own rifles or their own uniforms. They were required to adopt the equipment specified by the National Army. And marksmanship scores were used by the regular Army, among other purposes, to evaluate state officers. But that centennial election of 1876, as I think we all remember or have been reminded, brought to an end the effort of Reconstruction on the part of the United States government. It is the attempt to use federal power to establish the rule of law and the Constitution in the aftermath of the Civil War. This failure contributed, in turn, to the great migration of Black Americans to northern industrial cities. There, they would be met by police officers, armed in the name of safety and security, despite which technology, as Freud noted, these values remain elusive and our sense of discontent increases. Well, thanks so much for your attention. And I'll invite Professor Warren to join me for some questions.
Thank you so much for that really interesting talk, Professor Hevly. So for members of the audience, this is an opportunity to ask questions you might have, and you're very welcome to submit them in the Q&A feature on Zoom, and can upvote questions on Zoom. For those watching on YouTube or Facebook, you can also enter questions into the comment feature of both platforms, and we'd be happy to bring them together and ask Professor Hevly about them. So maybe I could begin and ask if you could speak, Bruce, a little bit about how you became interested in this project.
Well, I was fortunate enough to spend a sabbatical year in Norway. And as it happens, my family there actually lives in one of the towns. There are 3 towns in Norway that rotate in having the national shooting championships every year. As I sort of became a little bit sensitized to the landscape there, I noticed that there were shooting ranges in almost every town in Norway. There are various reasons for this. And it also became clear that Norwegians, taken all in all, are fairly heavily armed. But with some notable exceptions, they don't shoot each other very much. And so I sort of became interested in a kind of a comparative history of marksmanship. And I've been pursuing that now for some time because I wanted to understand if looking at the history of target ranges would give us any kind of insight into the ways in which Americans have chosen to use firearms over our history. I think, a lot of us grow up with what's maybe the last kind of unexamined bastion of technological determinism, which is the idea that the presence of firearms leads directly to firearm crime. And that seems to be true in the United States. It's not true everywhere. And so it seems like that might be something worth understanding.
Indeed, that's really fascinating. So we've got a bunch of questions that have come in already. Perhaps the one to start with is, did gun companies like Remington and Colt employ the same rhetoric of efficiency, discipline, and science in their advertisements? In other words, did these companies try in any way to govern or guide the behavior of the users of their products? You spoke about idealized targets. Maybe you could say a little more about this.
Well, there's an enormous sort of range of advertising strategies, and advertisements are actually pretty good sources for understanding this. The most, I think, clear example that's sort of responsive to this question is what happens at the DuPont Corporation at the beginning of the 20th century. And DuPont by that time had wound up buying the Remington Arms Company and owning it for a while. DuPont had invested very heavily in encouraging trap and skeet shooting because they were selling ammunition, and in shooting competitions, people burn through a lot of ammunition in a short amount of time. Hunters don't shoot a lot, but target shooters do. And so as part of this, DuPont encouraged women to take up trap shooting as well. And they encouraged this partly to get women used to the idea that they could defend the family home with a shotgun if that were called for. And the target then that shows up in this advertisement is hobos. Hobos were apparently something of great concern. And the idea was that if a woman was used to skeet shooting, very comfortable with a shotgun, she could effectively defend the family home. DuPont encouraged then, very largely through editorials that were ghost-written by the DuPont advertising arm and placed in newspapers around the country, DuPont encouraged the establishment of what became the Civilian Marksmanship Program, or the National Board for the Promotion of Rifle Practice. And this came after the Dick Act of 1903 basically led the federal government to exercise the control I mentioned over the National Guard in the states. What DuPont wanted to do was kind of reestablish the idea of a militia, which had kind of gone away in the United States, but the idea that every male between the age of, say, 14 and 40 should be practicing with a rifle in case the need arose. And the National Board for the Promotion of Rifle Practice oversaw the distribution of federal weapons to shooting clubs, and also the provision of free ammunition for training at these clubs. And like with skeet shooting, DuPont figured that if they could get a lot of people taking up target shooting, they could sell a lot of ammunition. There was at that point, I think, a good example of a company promoting target shooting of certain types, basically to ensure their success as a consumer products company.
Fascinating. So we have another question about the kind of, I think, the we have several questions about the broader implications of arming the police. And one of them is, did arming of police officers and admiration of marksmanship become part of the broader progressive movement in the early 20th century?
Well, I don't know if I would, I don't know how to sort of put it into a movement as an element of a movement, but I as you've heard, I sort of tend to talk more in kind of historical terms about the resonances among different sets of values. So if we imagine that progressivism is, partly appealing to the idea of a technical elite or of technical expertise, then I think marksmanship with modern weapons is at the time, I think, represented as something very much akin to that. Now that, I think maybe that the set of values to which police marksmanship appeals has certainly changed over time. But I think there's a kind of an element of sort of scientific expertise that's associated with the rhetoric of target shooting in the early 20th century. And as I say, it's very much akin to the values that are enunciated by people who, for example, promote laboratory courses for students, whether they're going to be scientists or not. If they learn the careful habits of the laboratory, they'll be better suited to go out and be corporate employees, accountants, engineers. And target shooting is sort of promoted in the same terms.
Really interesting. So one question that's come up is whether there was a kind of counter movement or a pushback to the arming of police. Were there sectors of New York society, for example, that objected to the idea of arming the police with revolvers in the period of your research?
Yeah, I haven't really looked at that at all. I mean, since I've been pursuing, I've been trying to understand what goes on in target ranges. So I haven't looked to see if there was some pushback. I know there are some other scholars who have looked at especially the history of the Sullivan Law in New York City, which doesn't have to do with the police being armed, but it has to do with everybody else not being armed, basically. An effort to keep firearms sort of off the streets by making it legally very difficult for people to possess and carry firearms in New York City. So there is some really nice history of that. Certainly there was strong pushback to the idea of encouraging students to shoot. And that came mainly from the pacifist movement, again, around the turn of the century, led by people like the Harvard professor, William James, who objected to the idea that all the students would be put into corps of cadets and they would be given all kinds of privileges if they took up military training. Many objected to the practice on campuses of making the most attractive young woman on campus the honorary colonel of the campus corps of cadets. So she would sort of be an ornament to the procedures and would attract more young men to military training. When William James talked about trying to find a moral equivalent to war, he was protesting directly against marksmanship training for students.
One of the things that is characteristic of current, contemporary debates about gun rights or the possession of firearms versus your talk is the let me phrase this in a different way. One of the terms that did, or references that didn't appear in your talk is the Second Amendment, and obviously that's something that's very that is a centerpiece of a lot of current debates about gun ownership and gun rights. Did references to the Second Amendment play a role in this story about arming the police and about the elevation of marksmanship to a kind of sport that provided discipline and orderly habits?
Yeah. Well, there's also quite a bit of really great scholarship on the Second Amendment, not by me, but I've read, a fair amount of it, and I think part of what's important to understand is that, at least, what I find compelling are histories that point out that the Second Amendment is kind of unintentionally transformed by the end of the Civil War, so that the amendments adopted at the end of the Civil War to guarantee rights to individuals made what had been sort of collective rights into individual rights. And the Second Amendment, kind of got thrown into that bin and sort of became available for renegotiation, which is kind of what we've been doing for the last 160 years. There's very little, there are very few instances that I've seen of people in the period that I study taking a kind of a absolutist stand on, an individual right to keep and bear arms outside of the police. I don't think I've ever seen the Second Amendment come up in anything written about, say, target shooting at Creedmoor, or in the more kind of broad sort of discourse surrounding target shooting. Target shooting is very often promoted in terms of preparation for service to the state. Not about, say, self-defense, certainly not about overthrowing the state if you sort of decide it becomes necessary. It's overwhelmingly encouraged in terms of citizenship. For a while, the government was sort of handing out surplus weapons to folks, when the government asked for those weapons to be returned, people would say, "Oh, sure, here it is," or "I'm not working in a bank anymore. Should I send you back the gun?" They certainly always seem to have thought of it in terms of their obligation and relationship to the state. And Teddy Roosevelt promoted it in similar terms. For example, advocating that every Boy Scout camp had to have a rifle range, which became the American practice. It's not true elsewhere.
Yeah. Thank you. So there's a couple of questions that are thematically connected, and so I'm going to ask one of them and then reference the other one. So the question is, the viewer was wondering if you could expand more on the final portion of the lecture regarding how the development of shooting mixed with the arrival of African Americans at the end of the Reconstruction. There's a couple of other questions in the Q&A as well about sort of elaborating on the sort of the relevance of this study for the longer history of racial violence and policing, and thinking about maybe also thinking about differences between racial violence in the North versus the South in this period.
Okay, so those are big
questions.
I guess when I wrote that conclusion, I was just sort of imagining a way to draw a couple of threads together. So as it happens, and this is, of course, at least contingency, if not coincidence, it's the governor of New York who cedes the presidential election in 1876. And part of the bargain that's struck is basically the end of Reconstruction, to which Republicans agree in exchange for the presidency. The end of Reconstruction obviously creates conditions, as we know, in the South that serve as part of the incentives for Black Americans to leave the South when they have the opportunity to do so. And their self-defense on the part of those citizens in the South is very strictly curtailed. It's often attempted. It definitely becomes a part of the culture, but it's also difficult to maintain. When there's a demand for industrial labor in the North, that serves as an incentive for folks to move to take those industrial jobs. And so partly as a product of that decision with Governor Tilden at the center, Reconstruction fails, and ultimately Black Americans begin to move across the country into industrial cities to take industrial jobs. And when they do that, they then confront the Northern system of industrial urban peacekeeping, which, also, I think, thanks to New York, that's a abbreviated argument. Thanks to New York, we have this system in which firearms are used as a part of the preservation of urban order. Now, could things have been otherwise? I think historians always have to say, yes, things could have been otherwise. That's part of, our practice as historians. As it happened, though, these two currents, intersect again, and we can kind of close the loop between the 1870s and the early 20th century in that way.
Fascinating. So I want to ask this question because it has 9 upvotes on Zoom. Okay. How do you see the history of policing informing the police force today? What has changed? What has stayed the same? Speaking of big questions, right?
Yeah. So again, my larger project, it has to do with the history of target shooting, not the history of policing per se. But I think, we're all aware that sort of marksmanship regimes have changed. And this occurred in military training and also in police training, moving much more towards a sort of more dynamic training scenarios. So rather than shooting at bullseyes over long ranges, there's a much greater emphasis after a certain point on what you might call reactive shooting, shooting at pop-up targets or shooting in sort of, model scenarios, urban streetscapes. And even for hobbyists, there's the emergence of what's called cowboy action shooting, which is sort of really popular around the world, not just in the United States. And there are actually some sort of sociologists who have looked at some of these more recent shooting regimes. But the emphasis certainly on, among sort of professional trainers is very, very responsive, very quick reactions to a perceived threat. It's not really the old Creedmoor style. I think that's fair to say.
Yeah. So we have time for one last question, and I'm going to kind of lump 2 together that have come in. Both are about comparisons between armed police in the United States and the arming or not arming of police in other countries. So as many of us know, the British bobbies on the street in the United Kingdom don't carry firearms. In other countries, police regularly do. A couple of viewers were asking if you could think about those comparisons a little bit, and one was asking as well whether the historical process of arming the police in the United States had an impact on decisions in other countries to arm or not arm the police.
Yeah, I don't really know that I can answer that question. Mm-hmm. I can give you one bit of comparative evidence, that the one that I have. And again, I mean, this refers to something I've already talked about, but if you look at the history of scouting in Britain, mm-hmm. as opposed to the history of scouting in the United States, even though the founder of scouting in Britain modeled Boy Scouting on the military activities of scouts, military scouts, and also he modeled scouting on the activities of sort of imperial constabulary forces, like the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. He was pretty adamant that scouts should be what he called peace scouts. And he insisted that he was not undertaking military training of young people, boys and girls, in the British scouting program. Now, there's a lot of room for kind of discussion on exactly this point, because there's some counter evidence that I think is important too. But the scouts in the United States, again, partly at the behest of Teddy Roosevelt, were very insistent that to aid in the maturation of young men and to promote good citizenship, you had to train Boy Scouts, at least, in the use of firearms. And to the extent that, you know, good citizenship is something that's disciplined by police officers, you know, I think you could see those values maybe carrying, you know, continuing to carry over. Now, that's not really an answer to a question about kind of the comparative history of the police in different places, but it's the one kind of comparative instance that I could point to.
Well, I think it's a really fascinating piece of a larger, much more complex answer, right? That probably we can't get to in the time that we have. Many thanks again, Professor Hevly, for this really terrific talk. And thank you as well to all of our attendees this evening. We look forward to seeing you again on February 10th for our final talk of the series by Professor Margaret Amara. Have a good evening.